corral. But it's my privilege to introduce the theme of today's chapel, the annual Halbrook Family Freedom Lecture. Nearly a decade ago, this lecture series was established by class of 1967 graduate John Halbrook. He envisioned every Taylor student gaining a deeper appreciation for both the privileges and the responsibilities afforded to citizens under the Constitution of the United States, and then carrying that vision of engaged citizenship into their workplaces, their communities, and their churches. And it's to that end that we are thrilled today to be hosting a woman who has thought as deeply about those topics as anyone you're likely to meet. But before Ambassador Lindsay introduces her to you formally, first I'll ask that you stand for the reading of today's scripture. This is 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 to 21. Dear friends, let us love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who loves has been fathered by God and knows God. The person who does not love does not know God, because God is love. By this, the love of God is revealed in us, that God has sent his one and only Son into the world so that we may live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, if God so loved us, then we also ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time, but if we love one another, God resides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we reside in God, and he in us, in that he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testified that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God resides in him, and he in God. And we have come to know and to believe the love that God has in us. God is love, and the one who resides in love resides in God, and God resides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because just as Jesus is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears punishment has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and yet hates his fellow Christian, he is a liar. Because the one who does not love his fellow Christian whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And the commandment we have from him is this, that the one who loves God should love his fellow Christian too. This is the word of the Lord. Please greet your neighbors as you take your seats.
Michael and I have personally known Cherie Harder for nearly 20 years through her service on the board of trustees for Gordon College and her good work at the Trinity Forum. Cherie Harder serves as the president of the Trinity Forum. Prior to this, she served in the White House as special assistant to the president and also director of projects and policies for First Lady Laura Bush. Cherie is a Rotary Scholar. She holds an honors BA in government from Harvard University, has a postgraduate diploma in literature from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. She's a senior member at Cardis. She's a board member of the American Convergence Center for Policy Resolution, an advisory board member for the National Museum on American Religion, and also a past board member of the C.S. Lewis Institute. She's a woman of deep faith, of strong leadership, of good character. She is smart but wise, strategic but guided by the Lord, and grounded in her Christian commitments. Would you please welcome a very Taylor warm welcome to our friend Cherie Harder.
It's such an honor to be able to do this lecture. I was looking over some of the folks who have given this lecture in the past, great scholars like Os Guinness and Robbie George and Arthur Brooks, statesmen like Richard Lugar and others. And I am neither a scholar nor a statesman. As Rebecca said, I lead an organization called the Trinity Forum, which aims to cultivate and promote and disseminate the best of Christian thought leadership for the common good, and provide a space for leaders to wrestle with the big questions of life in the context of faith, in the hopes of not only achieving greater wisdom, but coming to better know the author of the answers. And it's in that context that I am here today to kind of wrestle with one of those big questions with you today, which is this. At a time in our country when there is so much division, polarization, atomization, fracture, loneliness, and anger, what's the cause of our civic crisis? And what's the cure? And I'll give a spoiler. I want to suggest that actually our political dysfunction and civic division has its roots in spiritual deformation. That we're looking for our deepest sense of identity, meaning, and purpose in the wrong place, and freighting our politics with higher hopes and greater allegiance than it can support. In short, we have a crisis of identity and idolatry. We're looking for love in all the wrong places. But it's in that crisis that we also have an extraordinary opportunity for people of faith to forge a reformation of civic life characterized by properly ordered loves, a love of God and neighbor, a heart for justice, a creative orientation towards reconciliation and the flourishing of our communities. During his time on earth, Jesus was quite deliberate in gathering not mere affirmers of a set of police or promoters of a code of ethics, but disciples, those who followed his ways. And he declared that the way we can know his disciples is by their love. But today, in contrast, we face a real crisis of fear, loathing, and even contempt. By some surveys, more than 40% of Americans view their opponents, their political opponents, as evil. Nearly 20% of partisans on either side admit to, quote, thinking on occasion the country would be better off if large numbers of the opposition died. In a recent Washington Post and University of Maryland poll, nearly a third of those said that political violence against the government can sometimes be justified. And a new poll by Public Religion Research Institute said that things have gotten so bad that, quote, true patriots may need to resort to violence to take back the country, which 25% of the country agreed with. And sadly, the numbers were even higher among evangelicals. We're in a time where fondness for fighting is considered courage. Insult and invective is valorized as telling it like it is. And kindness and restraint is sometimes ridiculed as weakness. All too often, those in public life or even just on public forums who dissent from those divisive and extreme tactics are threatened with everything from, if you're in politics, a primary challenge, to doxing, to cancellation, to even death threats, which of course has the effect of driving away thoughtful, measured voices from the public arena and leaving the ground to those who thrive off the mix of adulation and negative attention that their belligerence produces. The result is a public square increasingly divided into warring factions, each convinced of the loathsome nature of the other side and the need for their total defeat. Increasingly, we view our fellow citizens not as neighbors, but as enemies. So how did we get here? I want to offer just a few ideas about the ways that it seems like our civic dysfunction and our spiritual dysfunction are linked before then looking at the hope before us. First, I believe that we have placed too much hope in politics. Now, that may seem a very strange thing to say as someone who worked for a number of different people on Capitol Hill, worked for a think tank, worked for a federal agency, and even worked in the White House. But I'll argue that this is actually something that has a big factor and increasingly widespread. We've looked to politics for our identity. We've looked to personalized and politicized information streams for our sense of truth. And we have looked to political combat for our sense of purpose and to bolster a sense of community. Now, just to unpack each of those in terms of identity, one of the most significant and in many ways unsettling trends of the last couple decades is the extent to which partisan politics has become a primary source of identity for a growing number of Americans. One kind of example of this is it used to be quite common to marry someone from a different party, but not from a different faith. In the last few years, that has actually flipped. It is now actually much more common in our country to marry someone of a different faith than of a different party. I was reading the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal just recently that people are now increasingly unlikely to date outside of their party, although very likely to date outside of their faith. In the past, different political scientists actually considered religion, as well as ethnicity and gender, to be the bedrock forms of identity that shaped our other senses of identity. They were called the unmoved movers. There's actually been evidence to suggest that that is now changing, and people are willing to shift their religious, ethnic, or even class identities to align with the demographics of their political tribe. This often plays out in the way that we see and view other people. And I'll give just two examples of this. When I was actually in college, I came from a very conservative Christian background and essentially rolled off a mountain and found myself at Harvard. And enrolled in a women's studies class, because I always thought, you never hear about the women, what were they doing? And it turned out it was a fairly ideologically skewed group of classmates, which I did not know at the time. And with the complete naivete of a small town girl from New Mexico, at one point, one of my classmates was talking about how terrible pro-lifers were, and then asked, presumably rhetorically, does anyone even know someone who's pro-life? So I shot my hand up and gave what I thought was a very empathetic explanation for why I believed this, and then had everyone in the class turn at me and hiss. It is a sobering feeling to realize that suddenly everyone else in class sees you not as a full person, but actually as a representative of a viewpoint they dislike and want to see silenced. Another example of this from a man I actually just had the pleasure of interviewing a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have heard of Tim Alberta, who is a political reporter for The Atlantic and recently wrote a book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And he opens with a really unsettling anecdote, which is a few years ago, his father, who had been the pastor of an evangelical church for over 30 years, the church that he grew up in, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. He came back to speak at his father's funeral and, of course, had a reception at the church the day before the funeral. He had recently written something that was critical of Rush Limbaugh and a former president. And although he had grown up in that church and was there to speak at the memorial service of his father, who had been the pastor for 30 years, what he experienced was one person after the other coming up to him to say how much they disagreed with and disliked his critique of Rush Limbaugh or the former president. Something has jumped the proper bounds and affected the way that we see each other and how we relate. Now, why has this happened? Obviously, political scientists and sociologists have explored this for many years, and there's different explanations, and most of them quite good. As families have increasingly fragmented and work has become more volatile and demanded more mobility, deep connections to neighborhoods, communities, and extended families have thinned. the institutions and the people who helped at one point form a really robust sense of community have become fewer, sometimes less reliable. And in the aggregate, it seems like this is not the case here at Taylor, but in the aggregate, we the people report having far fewer friends than we did just a decade ago. And a far greater number of people in the country report having no friends at all. So we're made to be in community, and when people do not have actual friends, they go looking for community. And increasingly, we conduct our search online. And the kind of community that is most easily cultivated through online and social media interaction is that of people who agree about something and get really fired up over it. And it's an old rule in politics that it's generally a lot harder to get people excited about something that they all support, and much easier to get people really excited about something that they all dislike. And so one of the things that sociologists have observed over the past several years is the rise of what they call affective polarization. That is, tribes of people who are bound together not by shared agreement or shared love, but rather shared opposition to a person, an idea, or a party. A sense of belonging or community or tribe is increasingly built around shared hostility. So, but at the same time that is going on, and we are living more of our lives online, we're also getting more of our information online. Technology companies are very, very good at keeping our attention. And they have found that one of the best ways to do that is to construct algorithms that customize our information streams to that which either confirms our opinions or provokes our outrage, usually by showing us the worst possible examples of the other side. It's something that's often called a nut picking. You know, we see examples of people who say uncommonly stupid or silly or malicious things that we disagree with, and we tend to start to think like, well, they're all that way. And that might be great for social media engagement, but it's not so great at giving a sense of balance and perspective. It leaves us increasingly open to misinformation. And by virtually every metric, falsehood increasingly predominates so much of social media. It reaches more people, it penetrates more deeply, it spreads faster, and it's much more, we just sort of eat it up. And it becomes much more difficult for even the really conscientious and intentional to distinguish between truth and falsehood, reality and fantasy. It is the necessary precondition for conspiracy theories to flourish. And sure enough, we are seeing a lot more of those, people buying into them and getting increasingly worked up, fearful, scared, and angry about a situation which may not even exist. So at the same time that our identities are growing more political, our information streams are growing more polarized and provocative, and our politics is growing more apocalyptic. Our sense of what politics can and should do is increasingly becoming divorced from the realistic, and the reaction to the news of the day more exaggerated and more belligerent. But perhaps the most disturbing part of our current crisis is the misplaced search for a sense of purpose and significance that's reflected in the growing syncretism that baptizes temporal political ends with eternal significance. Disagreements over matter of policy become a war of good versus evil, where the fate of the country or the culture lies in the balance, and compromise where the opposition becomes, in this kind of thinking, capitulation to evil. Heroism, therefore, consists of crushing your enemies and their ideas, and virtue requires ever more determination and force in resisting such evil, doing whatever it takes to triumph. Each of these distortions are fueled, of course, by a sense of fear as opposed to love. They also spring from misplaced hopes and priorities, and they freight our politics with far more than we can bear. They're civic dysfunctions which actually spring from unmet spiritual hungers. Now, saying that, that's not to say that politics is not important. It is. It matters a great deal, whether we live under freedom or under oppression, whether we're under the rule of law or the thumb of strongmen, whether our government recognizes the dignity of life or not, whether our policies care for the least, the last, the marginal, or reward exploitation. It matters if there is peaceful order or frequent violence, if civil servants are reliable and competent, or if we don't know whether the ambulance will come. All of these matter hugely. If we care about our neighbor or care about justice or the common good, we should care about politics. But while politics is very important, it is not ultimate. No matter how noble the political goals, there are limits to what politics can do. In a fallen world, our needs will almost inevitably exceed our resources. Procedural justice will be flawed in execution. Priorities and goods will be contested. Motives will be mixed. And self-interest can cloud the point of view of even the most humble and discerning. This is why the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr defined politics and liberal democracy as offering only proximate solutions to insoluble problems. That is, he acknowledged that political efforts necessarily involve weighing competing goods and obligations and reaching, at best, temporary resolutions. Instead of casting political issues into dualistic battles of good versus evil, waged by heroes and villains, this point of view recognizes that many of our political decisions, perhaps not all, but many, are made by leaders faced with lousy options, changing circumstances, insufficient information, under pressure, and amidst opposition. Liberal democracy is never utopian, and if we hope that it will be, we open ourselves up to actually contributing to much of the problem. So much of the energy animating our current battles comes from just such misplaced utopian hopes, combined with a Machiavellian sense that whatever means are employed are justified given the ends. And like virtually all attempts at a utopianism, the end is generally injustice. There is a very different way, not only explicitly articulated in the Bible, but also modeled by different politicians throughout history. Sometimes it can be very useful to look to people of the past. I think it was Immanuel Kant who talked about the actual proves the possible. When we look at what people actually did, we can sometimes see new possibilities for our own time. And one person who I have thought is perhaps particularly inspiring is a guy named Václav Havel. Now, many of you have heard of Havel. Havel became the president of the Czech Republic, and I believe it was in 1991. And while the Czech Republic in 1991 is very different from the United States in 2024, there were definitely some similarities. It was a deeply riven and polarized place. There was a lack of trust. There was a high degree of partisanship as well as disillusionment. People feared, disliked each other. There was a similar sense of atomization. And once he became president, rather than immediately jumping in and kind of instituting his 90-year plan to revamp the country, Havel did something very interesting. He actually took time off for reflection, prayer and reflection, and writing. And he wrote down some of his reflections, which was later actually published as letters to his wife. And he wrote this about his current time. He said, "I constantly get the advice that I should be tougher, more decisive, more authoritative. For a good cause, I shouldn't be afraid to pound the table occasionally, to shout at people, to try to rouse a little fear and trembling. Yet the simple fact is that directness can never be established by indirection, or truth through lies, or the democratic spirit through authoritarian directives. Of course, I don't know whether directness, truth, and the democratic spirit will succeed. But I do know how not to succeed, which is by choosing means which contradict the ends. As we know from history, that is the best way to eliminate the very ends we set out to achieve. In other words, if there is to be any chance at all of success, there's only one way to strive for decency, reason, responsibility, sincerity, civility, and tolerance. And that is decently, reasonably, responsibly, civilly, and tolerantly. Leading with concern for means as well as ends will necessarily undercut the mythic status that the strong man and the extreme partisans seek to cultivate, as it admits to the fact that we all have limits to our understanding, wisdom, and ability. It acknowledges our needs for checks, accountability, and forgiveness at times. It recognizes the limits of political power as well as the dignity of others. But recognizing the limits and proper place of politics, while necessary, is not enough. So much of what ails us is our loss of connection to truth, to meaning, to God, and to each other. The anger, alienation, and aggrievement from which we suffer are serious. But there is a sure antidote, the virtue of love. Now, coming up and talking to you all about love may seem at times perhaps a little bit Pollyanna-ish, even Sunday school-ish. But it is both deeply practical as well as terribly challenging. Jesus described the summing up of the Gospels as loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. He even commanded us to love our enemies. Augustine, one of the great philosophers of world history, essentially defined virtue as the proper ordering of our loves. St. Thomas Aquinas defined love as to will the good of the other, a definition which points to its practical application in our common life. So love is not merely a feeling, but a commitment to the flourishing of others. So what does that look like in our political and civic context? Well, first, and perhaps most basically, it means getting to know our neighbors as a precondition to loving them and to willing their good. That may sound really basic, but at a time when we are an increasingly lonely, alienated, atomized people, it is actually profoundly powerful and profoundly countercultural. It also involves listening and paying attention to others. Again, seems so very basic. And yet, just in the last several months, the #1 New York Times bestseller, which was written by David Brooks, was called How to Know a Person, and is basically a book-length treatment of how to actually pay attention to your neighbors, to get to know them, to ask them questions, to hear what they're saying. He said that in the course of traveling around the country, he was struck by how many people are absolutely starved for the loving attention of someone else, just to pay attention to what they say. A third area consists of paying attention to the language that we use. Now, we are a big, diverse nation. We are going to have big disagreements. And there are people of faithful, thoughtful people who can reach different conclusions about different ideas. And it is wise and necessary to engage those differences and at times to contend for what is good and true and right, and perhaps to do so with real passion and persistence. But there is a big difference between contending forcefully and persuasively for that which we believe is true and using language which dehumanizes others. Increasingly, Our language as a whole has been oriented that way. Just to quote David Brooks again, he once did a study which I thought was fascinating. He looked at Google N-words to track how our language use in the aggregate has changed over time. And he found that the language of virtue, especially bravery, courage, kindness, and compassion, our word use had gone way down. Our word use of individualistic terms, commercial terms, and the language of domination had gone way up. Language, of course, not only reflects our thoughts, it helps shape them. And so one way of loving our neighbor in a way that has profound civic implications is by paying attention to our language. The liturgies that we engage in are embodied practices which help shape our loves. It means a great deal that almost all of Taylor undergrads came to voluntary chapel. You are currently involved in a liturgy which helps shape your loves in ways that may not even be entirely obvious to you at the time, but the repeated embodied practice shapes our heart. One of our great opportunities in a country that can seem to be coming apart with all of our growing division, discord, and dissension is that we can love our neighbors. We can be agents of grace at a grim time. And each practical step that we take towards that takes us further down the road of civic renewal. It's been said that souls are not saved in bundles, that God created each of us, He knows us, He loves us, He calls us by name, and He calls us to do the same, to reflect His love to our neighbors, our opponents, even our enemies, and to order our lives along those requirements of loving God and loving neighbor. Our current crisis that we face in our country, a crisis of despair, of loneliness, of division, of polarization, of fracture, is one that we are called to address, but through different means that are not purely political. We're called to creatively love God and our neighbors, and we can do so, as hopeless as our politics can sometimes seem, knowing that we serve a risen Lord, we serve a God who is love, and He has promised us that love never fails. Thank you.